Hello and welcome to this talk on leading across cultures, a tale about fish who see the water. My name is Valentina Turner. You can find me on the social webs at Valle de Oro and on the website valentinaturner.com. This talk is about how to lead remote teams who are culturally very diverse. I called it a tale about fish who see the water because like fish aren't really aware that they are swimming in the water, very often we are not aware about how much our culture actually shapes our communication and the way we relate to each other. This talk is very much based on business culture. So I understand that maybe your personal culture, your family, etc. might be different, but usually the business culture of a specific country is very much shaped in a coherent way. That's why you know what you do or what you wouldn't do in an office. Now, if we're remote and not in the same office, this can present some challenges because in the end, I'm sitting in my culture in front of my computer, and then I'm talking to somebody from a very different culture, but because we don't really see each other and don't experience the other culture, miscommunication is much more frequent. So, but let's step back a step first. Why is that actually important? So this is Alexa. My parents, well, my father, who loves to think that he's very technologically savvy, loves to invest in these new widgets, thingies, whatever. So he bought the Alexa when it just came out. And in my parents' house, it was Alexa, do this, Alexa, do that, Alexa, play this song, Alexa, play that song all day long. When my father was talking. The thing is that Alexa would completely ignore my mom, but completely. Until my mom figured out that she actually simply had to pretend she was my dad in terms of pitching her voice louder. So instead of doing her usual Mickey Mouse-ish, Alexa, please play ABBA, she would go, Alexa, play ABBA. And that would work. Because at the very beginning, Alexa wasn't aware of female voices. This has since been solved, etc. But the reason this came up is because the product and the testing team most likely did not include any women with higher pitched voices. Hence, in no test and in no product description, this actually ever came up. So diversity is important to make better products that can be used by more people. Now, this was a gendered example, but the same, of course, applies for software products, for example, if you aim to roll out on an international market. If you only stay within your own cultural bubble, that is fine too. But if you want to work with other businesses in other countries, you might want to think about how you can include their way of communication into your communication strategy. So when it comes to what shapes the culture, here we have a couple of parameters for what shapes the culture of a specific person: age, ethnicity, class, gender expression, physical abilities, race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, educational background, geographical location, income, marital or parental status, work experience, and worldviews. This is, of course, not an exhaustive list. Now, when it comes to business culture, what is most impactful is probably ethnicity or race, educational background, geographical location, and worldviews on the personal level. The office itself then will give a background where these things come into play. So, who has lived outside their own culture? If you have lived outside your own culture, think about what were the biggest differences when you went to university or when you went to work there. Like, what did you realize was very different to what you are used at home? Because that's the thing. You only realize how much you can trust what you know when you step out of that comfort zone and suddenly don't really know what you knew before. So this is something that works really well in groups, not so much when I do an individual presentation. Which colors do you see here? This is a frequent question that I ask. And usually I get back the answer, there's blue, green, yellow, maybe orange, and pink. Which is correct. Now, if this would be we could say this is a very international group. Now, if we look at this group, what do you see? Now, suddenly it's not all green. Now we have teal and turquoise and light blue and dark blue and navy. And suddenly, because this is a more homogeneous group, a more bluish group, we see the difference much more. This is why we very often underestimate the impact that culture actually has between in our own in-group. Let's say you work in an only US American company. You'll say, oh, but the people from Wisconsin are super different from the people of Florida, because you see those different shades of blue. However, if you work in an office where there's people from India and Vietnam and Germany and Estonia and the US, suddenly you see the similarities of Florida and Wisconsin much more than the differences, basically because though Florida and Wisconsin culture-wise might be very different, when it comes to business style, comparing them to Vietnam actually makes them quite similar. So, if your own team is homogeneous, foster the awareness for the differences that there are. And if your team is very colorful, you have a lot of different cultural baggage on your team, then compare your positions on the different ways to communicate. And this will be the part of the rest of this talk. So, for personality differences, you have personality tests. You can use the 4 tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. You can work with self-reflection. You can ask people to create a user manual. But all of these personality traits only make sense if you can understand them within the culture that the person came from. For example, I often get the feedback, especially from US colleagues, that I'm a very direct person. Now, when I talk to fellow German people, I often get the feedback that I'm very diplomatic and not very direct. That is because it's not that I'm direct per se. It's that compared to somebody else's culture, I can be more or less direct. So we actually can operate within sliding scales, and it doesn't depend that much where you stand yourself, but rather where you and your culture stand compared to everybody else you have to communicate with. And all of this is based on a book that's called The Culture Map. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to add the link, which I very, very, very much recommend. It's by Erin Meyer, and it's an amazing resource with lots of examples that you can use, especially if you're in office with different cultures. I'm trying to adapt this a little bit more for what happens when you are remote, because then many of the markers that you can see in office are a little bit more difficult to actually realize. So, these are the 8 variables or parameters that we're going to look at to compare cultures and placing individuals within these cultures. This map shows United States compared to Netherlands, compared to Italy, compared to the UK, and compared to France. You can go to erinmeyer.com/tools to map different countries against each other, or even to make a test for yourself to find out where you stand within your own culture, for example, if you have an homogeneous one culture only business team. Important. This is business culture. This does not mean that this is the culture as a whole. For example, we had this discussion about the United States, which is a very low context culture, where you usually say exactly what you mean and you don't require a lot of in between the lines reading. This is true for business culture, not necessarily for personal culture or for the village you grew up in or for your family. So keep that in mind. We're talking about business culture and how people expect businesses and professional relationships to work. So the first variable or parameter is communication. So we have 2 extremes. We have low context communication, which means communication is precise, simple, and very clear. No in between the lines reading what you say is what you mean. That's why there's a lot of repetition. For example, if you do a presentation course in the US, which is one of the most low context cultures in the world, you usually learn that in the introduction, you tell them what you're going to talk about, then you talk about what you're talking about, and then in the summary at the end, you tell them what you just talked about. So there's a lot of repetition of the most important concepts that you want to convey to somebody. Now, high context cultures require more layered processes. Messages are spoken, but there's also like a subtext that you want to understand. Some languages even have a word for that. So in Spanish we say that you have subentendido, like understood something, which means that somebody said something, but it was obviously understood that something else was also implied, even though it wasn't said obviously. In a remote context, this is actually quite tricky because in face-to-face communication, you can still draw on facial expressions, on the body language, etc., which if you only communicate in writing is kind of different. So if you realize that some of your team members kind of always think that there is some motive behind your words because you're from a lower context communicating culture, then this is something that you might want to address with them. Because again, it's not about how low or high context are you, but how low or high context are you in comparison with everybody else on your team. So I'm German myself, but I live in Spain, and my team is made up of people from all over the place. So some people are higher context and some people are lower context on my team compared to myself. And knowing that, and by placing them on this map as well, and talk with them about it, we kind of manage that I try to be very, very low context and make sure that they know that I'm low context so that we can like skip the entire was there any hidden message that I didn't get. On the flip side, my team tries to, when they talk to me, actually tell me what they want to tell me because they know I'm not always going to pick up on what they want to tell me. For some historical background, usually low context cultures tend to be of more mixed heritage, like the US or Australia or Canada, for example, who basically have a lot of recent immigration, so they need to be more literal because they cannot rely on a very sophisticated context because there's no historical context. On the other side, we have Japan or Korea or Indonesia that have a long history and who are more capable in like speaking between the lines. So this is communication. Evaluation. How do we express and how do we accept feedback? Especially negative feedback. And this is very important in business settings because if you are a team lead, you do give negative feedback because if somebody is not performing, you want to help them to turn around. So Germany, Russia, Israel, and the Netherlands are very, very comfortable with direct negative feedback and do not take it personal. So if somebody gives me direct negative feedback, I mean, I won't be super amused, but I can live with it. And I'm still going to have a glass of beer or wine after work with you because I know it's not about me. It's just you had to give me this feedback and that's what it is. Now, other cultures take it much more serious or much more personal. So if you know that somebody comes from a culture where negative feedback is given indirectly, make sure that you manage to match that level of feedback giving. For example, on my own team, I have one person from the Netherlands, which we can give feedback each other very, very easily because we come from a very, very similar background when it comes to how we digest negative feedback. But with people on my team that are from India or from Vietnam or from South Africa, I try to be more indirect with the negative feedback and to always accompany it with a lot of reassurance that this is nothing personal, but that I'm really only talking about the work performance. Because otherwise it will be perceived as a personal threat. And just knowing this actually helps me to adjust my communication. And this is specifically important around written communication, because written negative feedback, just by the fact that it's written down, is already more direct than some business cultures are used to. So by adjusting the way you express yourself in these situations can actually be very, very helpful. Persuasion. How do you manage to get people to understand, agree, endorse your point of view? So let's say you want to get to a result, you want to make a decision about something, and you need to either convince your lead, your own boss, or your peers to actually endorse this. Concept first cultures usually focus on the theory first. Like, what is the theory around this? Why would this work? And then move over to the conclusion or the solution itself. While application first cultures tend to put more emphasis on the solution first and then derive the reasoning or the theoretical or philosophical discussion from there, if at all. And here, actually, being German puts me at a very, very, very big distance from the US culture. Germany, I mean, we have Goethe and some very, very important philosophical thinkers. I would always think about what is the baseline, what are the reasons, what is the conceptual underlying of my decision, and then I would move to, and this is why we need this solution. And very often, my US colleagues or my US superiors wouldn't get why I was doing all this fluff up front instead of directly coming to okay, this is what we need to do because. So basically the logic is, I would say, this is the situation, therefore we need to do this, while from a more application first point of view, it would be, we need to do this because this is the situation. And then sometimes the this is the situation can actually even be left out of the conversation altogether. So look at where whether you're on the left of the right or the right on this graph from the people that you want to persuade, and adapt your presentation style accordingly. Leading, egalitarian or hierarchical? I'm pretty sure that this is something that all of you have basically already encountered in some way or another. Some countries just work better with democratic or egalitarian structures, and some countries expect from the leader or from the boss to know what they want to do. And if you want to propose, let's discuss this and come to a joint conclusion, in a business environment where people are used that the boss knows what they want, you're going to lose any authority that you had, because people will think that you don't know what you want. So this is interesting when you have very multicultural teams. So let's say I have people on my team that are from the Netherlands or from Sweden, but I also have people on the team that are from Russia or from Poland or from Peru. How do I make sure that I get both the input from the Dutch and the Swedish people who want to participate within this whole leading panorama, while at the same time telling the people who want a firmer expression of, I know where we are going and you're safe because I know where we are going. How do you balance that out? Here, actually, written communication is probably a little bit easier because you can simply move to like different DMs with different people without them overhearing each other. But it's something to keep in mind when you have to make decisions that are controversial. Because with controversial decisions, the more egalitarian business cultures will want to discuss this. They will want to know why, how, and what else you considered. Why the more hierarchical cultures will really appreciate seeing that you know that you are doing this because you know it's the right thing, and not because some ominous group of people has talked around it forever, because that's how it feels like from a hierarchical point of view. Deciding. Who decides? Top-down or consensual? UK, US, here are square in the middle, so if you're from one of these cultures, compare with where people are coming from before you decide. Interestingly, Japan is consensual, while they are also very hierarchical. The reason here is that very often decisions start at the very bottom, get discussed, and then the input is actually moved upwards in the hierarchical ladder, but the person who finally decides is on the top. And then it gets enacted top down. So you can be very hierarchical and still consensual, and the other way down. Though usually consensual means more egalitarian and top down means more hierarchical. So see what the people on your team need. And if you are in doubt, talk to them about these different parameters so that you can get to a joint understanding about where you both actually stand. Trusting. Why should your team, why should your colleagues trust you? There's task-based trust, which is basically based on you do good work consistently. If you say that you're going to do something, you're going to do this. So I trust you because I know you get shit done. I trust you because I've already had 25 situations where you said you would do this thing and you did that thing on time and to the expected requirements. Perfect. I trust you. This is entirely task-based. You could be a complete moron in personal life. I wouldn't care. I trust you because I know your work is good. The other end of the spectrum is relationship-based trust. In this scenario, you trust somebody because you know them, because you've had a meal together, because you've shared time together, because you know their kids, you know their spouse, you are invested in their life. And so it almost tethers at the side of friendship. So even if that person does not always do everything that is expected, you still trust them because it's a relationship. So trust is not necessarily based on tasks. This is very important for multicultural teams because if you have people on the team that rely on task-based trust, you actually don't need that many personal interactions with them. Like, as long as you do what you are supposed to do and as long as you do what they expect you to do, you'll be fine. But if you are from a task-based trust culture and you have people on your team that are from a relationship-based cultures, make sure that you have regular one-on-one with your remote colleagues, that you have like virtual pizza parties or something, that you really invest the time that you have in one-on-ones with them to not only talk about work, but to also talk about personal things, that you remember their kids' names and maybe birthdays, that you send a postcard from time to time, so that you can create this trust level that you need to lead them based on a relationship that you are going to create together. Disagreeing. How okay is it to disagree with somebody? Some cultures, and Germany is one of those, which is also one of the reasons I'm often called direct. We are quite confrontational without taking it too personally, while other cultures usually avoid confrontation. This is especially important when combined with feedback. So people from more confrontational cultures can take any kind of disagreement quite well, even in public. So you can call these people out in the middle of a team meeting and probably get away with it. Now, for countries where confrontation is avoided, which often goes hand in hand with the notion of losing face, call people out privately, if at all. See ways that you can give feedback without breaking the group harmony, or losing the trust that you build up through the personal relationship. This does not mean that there is no disagreement, huh? It just means that the way you phrase your confrontations need to be much more cushioned. Or as my mom says, you need to put more flowers around them. And finally, scheduling. So Germany and Switzerland, we are the most linear time people in the world. Projects are very sequential. You complete one task, then you move to the next. You do one thing at a time. Don't ever interrupt me. I'm focusing on this deadline and I'm going to deliver on time. Very, very German. The emphasis definitely is on doing things swiftly, promptly, and on time. While most other countries are more on the flexible time of things, where projects are approached in a fluid manner, people jump from one task to the other, interruptions are fine and will not result in a total meltdown, and flexibility is more important than actually sticking to a plan. If you're a project manager and you're working with business cultures on the more flexible time part of the bargain, you're going to be frustrated at some point. And here is where these kind of concepts actually can help a lot. It's not about you. It's actually the way that people in this culture were brought up to conduct business. It is not personal. And as long as both sides are actually aware of these differences, you can try to move the needle a little bit closer to each other. So I'm going to be more flexible and you're going to try to be a little bit more on time, and it will make life easier for both of us. So this is a comparison that I draw when a new person from Vietnam started on my team. So I'm German, and though I've been living and working in Spain for quite a long time, I'm still very much influenced by German business culture because that's where I studied and that's where I grew up. And I know very little about Vietnam. So I did the comparison on the website, and this is the result. And as you can see, Germany and Vietnam are pretty much equally distant on every single parameter. Germany is much more low context than Vietnam. We have no problem with direct negative feedback. We are very principle first, application next. Actually more hierarchical than many people would think, but still much more egalitarian than Vietnam. That's where the whole where do you stand in relationship to somebody else comes into play. More consensual, much less relationship-based, much more confrontational, and the biggest difference is actually between linear time and flexible time. So knowing this, in our first one-on-one, I can already go into this one-on-one, starting to create a relationship, because I know that I will need this relationship in order to gain a level of trust. So instead of just asking, so how's the ticket work going? This is your first week. I'm also going to ask, like, what is your background? How did you get here? What are your expectations for this position? But not only for the work of it, but like, have you ever worked remotely? What is it that's most difficult about remote work? Is there anything that I can help you to make the transition a little bit smoother? Do you need an introduction to other people in your same region that you maybe can exchange tips with? Like trying to already move this towards a relationship-based trust level, because even though I'll be more than happy for her to simply do her job, I know that she needs to have a relationship-based connection with me in order for us to work together. And since I know this, I can actually provide for this, and thus ensuring that our long-term business relationship actually has a more firm grounding. Another big one is the low context, high context, and the negative feedback and the disagreeing part. So compared to Vietnamese business culture, my German business background makes me very direct and very prone to insulting or making the other part feel unsafe and criticized. And that's not what I'm going for. But I'm very aware that I might do these things by being my normal direct self without intending any harm. So by using this graph already at the very beginning, and every time I'm communicating somebody with this new hire, I can tell, look, I know that I tend to be very direct, and sometimes you might have the impression that I'm personally attacking you. Please know this is not my intention. And let's work together on finding a middle ground in terms of communication, where I try to be a little bit less negative, because that's how it feels from the receiving end, while you are a little bit more direct, so that we can actually meet in the middle. There will still be disastrous conversations, like that's just humanity, I guess. But at least with this framework, we can both kind of find our way to a communication that works. Also, on the leading spectrum, if she's from a culture that's more hierarchical and top-down, sometimes I'm just going to make decisions. And instead of asking for input on everything, if I already have a preferred decision, I'm going to adapt that and be like, okay, we're going to do this and this and this, knowing that it actually, while for me it sounds a little bit like I'm a tyrant or a dictator, from the receiving end, it can actually be very reassuring in terms of, okay, my boss actually knows what she's doing, even though I don't. So that can be super helpful. So on many of these variables, I can actually adjust my communication just by knowing where this person stands. So this is the US. So when I did this presentation for the first time, I worked in a company that was on the leadership level very US-centered. So I shared this map with my team so that they know how to talk with others that are from the US. This is only US. So in order to really understand on which side you stand and how to adjust your own communication style, you probably need to map your own culture on this. But what's really interesting here is that US culture is very, very, very low context. Trust is very, very task-based, and everything is very application first in terms of persuasion. Since these three dots are at the very, very, very end of the spectrum, I already know that anyone else will be more in the middle of the spectrum. And if my team only manages to improve communication on these three parts, like communicating more clearly with less contextual input needed, persuading with what is the outcome first, and making sure that they always do what they commit to so that they can create this task-based trust, we've already come a long way. So this was very, very helpful in order to create a more harmonious working together. So in a nutshell, it's not you, it's not me, it's the relative difference between the two of us and the business cultures that most shaped our relationship with each other. And if we keep that in mind, magic can happen. Thank you very much. This is the book, The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. You can also look at her website, erinmeyer.com/tools. There are a lot of interesting tools where you can map yourself and your own team on these different parameters. And you can find me on valentinaturner.com or at Valedeoro, both on Twitter and on Instagram.